The broken soldier's return. The mountain air bit at Mason Reed's face as he stepped onto the porch of his isolated cabin. 3 years since Afghanistan, and still the dreams came nightly. His fingers, calloused from both war and now chopping wood, gripped the railing as he watched the sun dip below the distant peaks. Another night, another battle, he muttered, the steam from his breath curling in the crisp autumn air. At 35, Mason had seen enough violence for several lifetimes. The Special Forces had taken the eager young man from rural Montana and returned a hollow-eyed veteran with a limp and nightmares that medication couldn't touch. His decision to retreat to this remote cabin had been met with concern from the few friends who remained. But solitude was the only balm that soothed his fractured mind. He retreated inside as darkness fell, pouring a finger of whiskey before stretching out on his worn sofa. Sleep came reluctantly, as always, but when it finally claimed him, the dream was unlike any before. Please, our time grows short. The veil thins. Find me, a woman's voice, melodic but desperate, echoed through his consciousness. Mason found himself floating in a space filled with mist and strange, luminous creatures. Before him, a shadowy figure reached out with slender fingers, her face obscured but her desperation palpable. Do it, before it's too late. Mason jolted awake, sweat-soaked despite the cabin's chill. The dream had felt more real than the wooden beams above him now. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the disorientation, when a blinding flash lit up the entire cabin. The impact shook the ground beneath him. Mason instinctively dropped to the floor, military training kicking in as he assessed for threats. When nothing followed, he cautiously peered through the window. A smoking crater marred the clearing 50 yards from his cabin, an unearthly blue glow emanating from within. What the hell? Mason grabbed his flashlight and pistol before venturing outside. The crater was small but perfectly formed, as though something had drilled rather than crashed into the earth. At its center lay a metallic object no larger than his palm, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Against his better judgment, Mason reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the cool metal, visions flooded his mind. A vast city of crystal spires crumbling into dust. Strange creatures fleeing from advancing shadows. And at the center of it all, a woman with scales glittering along her temples and cheekbones, her eyes cat-like and filled with both power and fear. You have heard my call, her voice rang in his mind. Our realm dies. You are our final hope. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Mason gasping on his knees beside the crater. The object now pulsed rhythmically in his palm, its light synchronizing with his heartbeat. Over the next 3 days, Mason tried to convince himself he was having a breakdown. He researched meteorites, called a university professor who dismissed him as a crank, and even considered seeing his VA therapist again. But each night, the dreams grew more vivid. Scenes of a dying world and the desperate queen who ruled it. On the 4th night, as Mason finally drifted off clutching the artifact, the bedroom walls around him began to shimmer and dissolve. This isn't real, he whispered. Even as the cabin disappeared completely, he found himself standing in a vast chamber with walls that seemed alive with swirling energies. Before him, seated on a throne of twisted metal and glowing crystal, was the woman from his visions. Her skin was pale with a subtle iridescence, her eyes amber with vertical pupils, and along her temples were small scales that caught the light like opals. She rose, her flowing garments shimmering as though woven from liquid silk. Mason Reed, she spoke, her voice the same that had haunted his dreams. I am Sarathia, sovereign of Cadraxis, the realm of eternal twilight. Her eyes narrowed as she approached. And you, broken soldier, may be our last chance for survival. The realm. Beyond the veil, Mason stood frozen, his military training providing no protocol for suddenly being transported to another dimension. The chamber around him pulsed with energy that made his skin tingle, and the woman, no, the queen, before him exuded power that was almost tangible. This isn't possible, Mason said, instinctively stepping back. I'm hallucinating. The PTSD finally broke my mind completely. Sarathia tilted her head, the scales at her temples catching the light. Your world's limitations are not our own, Mason Reed. Cadraxis exists in the spaces between realities, and now you exist here too. She gestured around them. Though not for much longer, if the great unraveling continues. As if to emphasize her point, a tremor shook the chamber. Crystalline fixtures chimed discordantly as dust rained from high ceilings adorned with constellations unknown to Earth. "My advisors!" Sarathia called, and from shadowed alcoves emerged figures as strange and beautiful as their queen. Most notable among them was a woman with violet eyes and hair that seemed to float as though underwater, despite the absence of currents. Unlike Sarathia's regal bearing, this woman carried herself like a soldier, her gaze sharp as she assessed Mason. "This is the savior?" she asked, circling Mason with unconcealed skepticism. "He doesn't look like much, my queen." "Careful, Lysandra," Sarathia cautioned. "Appearances in his realm differ from ours. I sense great potential within him." Mason found his voice again. "I'm not anyone's savior. I couldn't even save my own squad when—" He cut himself off, the memories still too raw. "Whatever you think I am, you're wrong." Sarathia approached him, close enough that he could see flecks of gold in her amber eyes. "The prophecy of 9 moons speaks of a warrior from beyond the veil, scarred in body and spirit, who carries the essence of flame. For 3 cycles, I have searched across the dimensional barriers for one such as you." "Why me?" Mason demanded. Another tremor, stronger this time, interrupted them. Lysandra steadied herself against a column, her expression grim. "Perhaps this discussion should continue after the Sovereign shows our guest. What exactly is at stake?" she suggested, throwing Mason a challenging look. Sarathia nodded. "Come, Mason Reed. See what becomes of Cadraxis." They led him through corridors of living stone to a balcony overlooking the realm. What Mason saw stole his breath. A city of impossible architecture stretched before him. Buildings that defied gravity intertwined with gardens that glowed with bioluminescent flora. But at the edges of this beauty, a darkness consumed everything, not shadow, but nothingness, a void that devoured reality itself. "The unraveling," Sarathia explained quietly. "It began a decade ago at the outermost reaches of our realm. Now it consumes a league each day. Soon, nothing will remain." Below in the city streets, Mason could see people, some humanoid, others more alien, but all clearly refugees. They huddled in makeshift shelters, children clutching toys as parents watched the advancing darkness with resigned terror. "These are but a fraction of those who once populated Cadraxis," Sarathia continued. "The last survivors of a dozen fallen kingdoms now gathered in Seraphium, my capital and the final bastion against oblivion." Mason's throat tightened. The scene was too familiar. Civilians caught in a war they didn't start, facing an enemy they couldn't fight. He'd seen those same expressions in Afghanistan. What could I possibly do against that? He gestured toward the encroaching void. Lysandra scoffed. "Exactly my question, my queen." Sarathia's gaze never left Mason's face. "The prophecy speaks of a binding ritual, a merging of your essence with our realm's core energy. Your kind possess something we do not, adaptive chaos, the spark of creation that allows you to change, to evolve, to endure. We need that spark to rewrite the fabric of Cadraxis before it unravels completely." "A ritual?" Mason echoed, suspicion rising. "You mean magic? That's not possible in your world, perhaps," Sarathia finished for him. "But here, it is our science, our truth, our only hope." Another tremor shook the palace, this one violent enough to crack the stone beneath their feet. In the distance, a spire collapsed, disappearing into the void. "We have little time," Sarathia said, urgency breaking through her regal composure. "I would not have brought you here if any other option remained." Mason looked from the desperate, Faces in the city below to Lysandra's challenging glare to Sarathia's pleading eyes. He thought of his empty cabin, his nightmares, the hollowness that had defined his existence since returning from war. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I'm just a broken soldier who couldn't save his own men." "Perhaps," Sarathia replied, touching his arm gently. "That is precisely why you were chosen. Those who have lost everything understand the true value of salvation." Mason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of countless lives pressing upon him. When he opened them again, determination had replaced confusion. "Tell me about this ritual," he said, and for the first time since his arrival, Sarathia smiled. Fire from within dawn in Cadraxis was unlike anything Mason had witnessed on Earth. Instead of a rising sun, the sky lightened gradually from all directions, as though the air itself became luminous. Mason stood in a courtyard of the palace, dressed in lightweight armor provided by Lysandra, black with subtle crimson accents that seemed to shift and ripple with his movements. "The sovereign insists you train with the royal guard," Lysandra said, tossing him a staff made of a material like polished obsidian. "If you truly are our salvation, you should at least know how to defend yourself." Mason caught the weapon with practiced ease. "I'm not exactly untrained," Lysandra's violet eyes narrowed. "Your world's combat and ours are different." Without warning, she lunged, her own staff a blur of motion. Mason barely blocked the strike, the impact reverberating through his arms. He countered with a sweep that should have taken Lysandra's legs from under her, but she moved like water, flowing around his attack before landing a blow to his ribs that sent him sprawling. "Different indeed," he wheezed, climbing back to his feet. For the next 2 hours, Lysandra drilled him relentlessly. Mason's military training helped his fundamentals, but fighting in Cadraxis involved an awareness of energy flows that he'd never encountered. Gradually, though, he began to adapt, his movements becoming more fluid as he intuited the strange physics of this realm. "You learn quickly, for an outlander," Lysandra admitted grudgingly, offering him a flask of shimmering liquid after a particularly grueling sequence. "Perhaps the sovereign's faith isn't entirely misplaced." Mason drank cautiously, finding the liquid refreshing with hints of something like cinnamon and mint. "Why do you doubt her so much?" Lysandra's expression softened momentarily. "I don't doubt Sarathia. I've served her since we were both barely more than children. I doubt the prophecy that places our entire realm's survival in the hands of a stranger." She took the flask back, her fingers briefly brushing his, especially when that ritual might cost her everything. Before Mason could press further, a messenger interrupted them, bowing deeply. "The sovereign requests your presence at the Council of Elements, Commander Lysandra. The Outlander is to accompany you." The council chamber was a circular room with 5 towering thrones arranged in a pentagram pattern. 4 were occupied by beings of distinct appearance, one seemingly composed of living stone, another with skin like flowing water, the third glowing with inner fire, and the fourth surrounded by swirling winds. Sarathia sat upon the central throne, which seemed formed from all 4 elements intertwined. "The council has reviewed the ancient texts," Sarathia announced as Mason and Lysandra entered. "The binding ritual requires preparation. Mason Reed must first awaken his inner essence before it can be harmonized with the realm's core." The elemental being of fire leaned forward, its voice crackling. "The Outlander carries the spark, but it lies dormant. He must be tested by each element to kindle his true nature." Mason stepped forward. "And if I fail these tests?" "Then we all perish," the water elemental replied simply, its fluid form rippling. Lysandra's hand found Mason's shoulder, squeezing briefly in what might have been reassurance or warning. "When do we begin?" "Now," said Sarathia, rising from her throne. "The void consumes another village as we speak. The first test came immediately." The earth elemental descended from its throne, its massive form towering over Mason. Without warning, it slammed its fists into the ground, sending shockwaves that opened fissures beneath Mason's feet. He leapt and rolled, narrowly avoiding plummeting into darkness. "Find stability within chaos," Sarathia called out. Don't fight the ground, become part of it. Mason didn't understand, but as another fissure opened, instead of jumping away, he relaxed into the motion, allowing his body to shift with the trembling earth. Suddenly, he felt connected to it, sensing the vibrations before they manifested. The earth elemental nodded in approval and returned to its throne. The water test followed, then air, each challenging Mason in ways that pushed him beyond physical limits into something more profound. By the time the fire elemental approached, Mason was exhausted but vibrating with a new awareness. Fire reveals truth, the elemental intoned, engulfing Mason in flames that didn't burn but penetrated to his core. What lies within you, Outlander? Pain erupted in Mason's chest, not physical but emotional, all his grief, rage, and survivor's guilt exposed at once. He fell to his knees, crying out as memories of Afghanistan flashed before him, the ambush, his men falling, his own desperate fight despite his wounds. Let it flow through you. Sarathia's voice reached him through the agony. Your pain is also your strength. Mason hadn't cried since the hospital. But now tears streamed down his face as he finally faced what he'd been running from. And suddenly, from within that pain came something else, a fierce determination, a refusal to fail again when others depended on him. The flames surrounding him changed color, from orange to deep blue, then to a white so intense it illuminated the entire chamber. When they finally receded, Mason remained kneeling, but something had fundamentally changed. Energy coursed through his veins, visible as faint luminous lines beneath his skin. Sarathia descended from her throne, her expression a mixture of awe and relief. The fire within you is awakened. Before anyone could speak further, a tremendous explosion shook the palace. Lysandra sprinted to a window, cursing in a language Mason didn't recognize. "It's Vazriel!" she shouted. "He's breached the outer defenses." Sarathia's face hardened. "How?" "The void hasn't reached. He's accelerating it somehow," Lysandra interrupted, already strapping on her weapons. "Using it as a weapon against us." Mason stood, the new energy within him surging in response to the threat. "Who is Vazriel?" "One who believes the end of Cadraxis is inevitable and seeks to control what comes after," Sarathia explained quickly. "He leads the void cultists who worship the unraveling." Another explosion rocked the palace. Without thinking, Mason extended his hand, and a shield of energy formed around them, absorbing the impact. Everyone, including Mason, stared in shock. "Well," Lysandra said, a reluctant smile forming, "perhaps you are useful after all, Outlander." Sarathia's eyes met Mason's, something unspoken passing between them. "The ritual must proceed immediately," she said. "But first, we must survive this attack." Mason nodded, the fire within him now a steady pulse. "Show me where to fight." The heart of the flame. The palace corridors had transformed from majestic halls into a battleground. Mason followed Lysandra, energy still coursing through his veins as they rushed toward the breach in the outer defenses. Guards in armor similar to his own fought against shadowy figures that seemed partially consumed by the void itself, Vazriel's cultists. Their willing sacrifices, Lysandra explained as they paused behind a pillar. They offer parts of themselves to the void, believing it grants them power over what remains. Mason watched in horror as one cultist's arm, entirely consumed by nothingness, passed through a guard's armor as though it weren't there. The guard screamed, his chest beginning to unravel where he'd been touched. "How do we fight that?" Mason asked. Lysandra unsheathed twin blades that glowed with inner light. "With essence weapons. They disrupt the void's influence." She tossed him a short sword with similar luminescence. "Focus your energy through it, like you did with the shield." Mason gripped the hilt, feeling an immediate connection to the weapon. When a cultist lunged toward them, he reacted instinctively. The blade flared brilliantly as it struck, and the void-corrupted assassin dissolved into particles of light. "Good." Lysandra nodded approvingly. "Now stay close. We need to reach the eastern courtyard where Sarathia is preparing the ritual chamber." They fought their way through the palace, Mason growing more confident with each encounter. The energy awakened during his elemental trials responded to his will, enhancing his strength and speed. Lysandra moved beside him with lethal grace, her fighting style both beautiful and terrifying. In a moment of respite after clearing a grand hall, Lysandra leaned against a wall, breathing heavily. "You fight well, Mason Reed," she admitted. "For an outlander. You're not so bad yourself," he replied with a half-smile. "For a—" He faltered, realizing he didn't know what to call her species. Lysandra's lips quirked upward. "For a Nereid? We're guardians of the realm's waters." She studied him curiously. "Does my appearance disturb you?" "No," Mason answered honestly. "Your beautiful didn't seem adequate for her otherworldly grace." "Remarkable." Something flickered in Lysandra's violet eyes, vulnerability quickly masked by determination. "We should continue." But as she pushed off from the wall, her hand briefly touched his, a contact that sent a different kind of electricity through him. They reached the eastern courtyard to find Cyrathia surrounded by a circle of crystalline pillars, each pulsing with different colored light. Her hands wove complex patterns in the air, leaving luminous trails that formed intricate symbols. When she saw Mason, relief washed over her features. "You're alive," she breathed. "Good. The ritual chamber is nearly prepared." Her gaze shifted to Lysandra. "Commander, secure the perimeter. Vazriel himself will come for us once he senses what we're doing." Lysandra bowed, but Mason caught the flash of emotion in her eyes as she looked between him and Cyrathia. Jealousy? Concern? Before he could decipher it, she was gone, organizing the remaining guards into defensive positions. Cyrathia beckoned Mason closer, her voice dropping to ensure privacy. "The ritual will bind your essence to mine, and through me to Cadraxis itself. Your adaptive nature, that spark of creation unique to your kind, will allow me to rewrite the fabric of our reality, making it resistant to the unraveling." "You make it sound simple," Mason said, noting the exhaustion behind her regal composure. "It is anything but," she admitted. "The binding is intimate. Our energies, our very beings will intertwine. And there is risk, to you or to me." Cyrathia's hand rose to his cheek, her touch cool but pleasant. "To us both. The energies involved could consume us entirely if not properly channeled." Her amber eyes searched his. "I would not ask this of you if any other path remained." Mason covered her hand with his own. "I know, and I'm willing." The words surprised him with their truth. In this strange realm facing annihilation, he'd found purpose again, something worth risking everything for. The moment lingered until a distant explosion shattered it. Cyrathia returned to her preparations, movements more urgent now. Mason watched, mesmerized by the otherworldly beauty of her ritual dance, the scales at her temples catching the light from the crystals surrounding them. "It's ready," she announced finally. "Take your place within the inner circle." Mason stepped forward, the energy patterns on the ground illuminating as he entered the designated space. Cyrathia stood opposite him, her ceremonial robes flowing around her like liquid starlight. "Once we begin, we cannot stop until completion," she warned. "Are you certain, Mason Reed?" Before he could answer, Lysandra burst into the courtyard, blood streaking her armor. "Vazriel approaches. His elite guard has broken through the western barricade." "We're out of time," Cyrathia said grimly. She looked to Mason, question in her eyes. "Do it," he nodded. Cyrathia began chanting in a language that seemed to vibrate in Mason's bones. The crystals around them pulsed in rhythm with her words, their light intensifying until it was almost blinding. She reached across the space between them, taking his hands in hers. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Mason gasped as Cyrathia's consciousness touched his, her memories, emotions, and essence flowing into him as his did into her. He saw centuries of her life in flashing images, her childhood in a now-vanished kingdom, her ascension to the throne, her desperate search across realities for their salvation. In turn, she witnessed his pain, his battles both external and internal, the guilt that had driven him to isolation. Their shared vulnerability created an intimacy beyond anything physical. "Beautiful," a cold voice interrupted. The sovereign and her pet outlander attempting the impossible. The ritual circle flickered as a tall figure strode into the courtyard. Vazriel was both magnificent and terrible, half of his body perfectly preserved, regal and handsome. The other half partially consumed by void, revealing glimpses of nothingness between strands of reality. "The unraveling cannot be stopped," he proclaimed, "only directed, controlled by those wise enough to embrace it." His gaze fixed on Sarathia. "I offered you partnership once. Now I offer only oblivion." With a gesture, he sent void-infused energy hurtling toward them. The ritual's protective barriers absorbed the attack but weakened visibly. "Continue the ritual," Mason told Sarathia, releasing her hands and drawing his essence sword. "I'll hold him off. You cannot break the connection now," she protested. "It will destroy us both." "Then finish it faster," he replied, stepping to the edge of the circle to face Vazriel. Behind him, he heard Sarathia resume her chanting, the words now rapid and urgent. Lysandra appeared at his side, her blades ready. "Together, Outlander," she said quietly. "For Cadraxis," Vazriel laughed. "How touching." The Nereid commander and the human savage, making their last stand. He launched another attack, stronger this time. Mason and Lysandra moved in perfect synchronization, their blades deflecting the void energy. The battle intensified as Vazriel's cultists joined the fray, forcing them to defend on multiple fronts while the ritual continued behind them. In the midst of combat, Mason felt the connection with Sarathia deepening, her energy flowing through him, strengthening his every move. Simultaneously, he became aware of Lysandra's presence beside him, her courage, her loyalty, her unspoken feelings. As Vazriel prepared his most devastating attack, Mason made a split-second decision. Instead of merely deflecting the void energy, he opened himself to it, using the techniques from his elemental trials to channel it, understand it. "Mason, no!" Lysandra cried, but it was too late. The void touched him, and in that moment of contact, Mason saw its true nature, not destruction, but transformation, the ending that precedes beginning. With newfound clarity, he redirected the energy, not back at Vazriel, but into the ritual circle. Sarathia gasped as the controlled void energy entered the binding ritual, her eyes widening in understanding as Mason rejoined her in the center. "Not resistance," he said softly. "Acceptance. We don't fight the void, we embrace it, guide it." As their hands clasped once more, the ritual transformed, incorporating the very force they had sought to oppose. The light from the crystals changed, now shot through with threads of beautiful darkness that danced in harmony with the radiance. Vazriel's confident expression faltered for the first time. "What are you doing?" But Mason and Sarathia, now moving as one, gave no answer as the ritual reached its climax.